It was spring 2006, and I was a contestant in the District 6 International Speech Contest. I was on the big stage. I was telling the story of how we went to Russia to adopt our son. He was 12 years old when we adopted him. It was emotional. It was intense. I had the audience in the palm of my hand. And then I didn't. I completely blanked out. Every speaker's worst nightmare, other than always my fly down. But I did not have the words. They left me. As I stared out at the audience and they stared back at me, mostly with pity. You've been an audience member, haven't you, when someone has had an awkward, forgetful moment, and you feel so bad for them. I'll tell you what, the speaker feels even worse. I stared at those 200 plus eyeballs for about 9 or 10 seconds, hoping the words would come to me. Now that doesn't sound that long, but when you're up there, it's an eternity. The words finally returned and I finished my speech. Needless to say, I didn't place. Maybe I was a close fourth. I'll never know. But that failure was a great lesson for me. I don't know about you, but I usually learn more from my failures than I do my successes. And as I reflected on that failure, I realized I had gone about preparing for this speech wrong. When I joined Toastmasters, I was a writer. I love to write. I love to give my speeches exactly the way I wrote them because they were just perfect the way I wrote them. Which meant I always had my completely written out speeches up at the front with me. And as I came to the International Speech Contest, I knew that people didn't use notes for that. So what was I going to do? The next best thing. I would memorize my speech word for word. Have you ever done that? I know you haven't, Talia. Have you ever tried to memorize something word for word? Well, if you haven't, good for you. For most people, memorizing word for word is very time consuming, and it can lend itself to a bit of an artificial presentation. Maybe you've even seen people who have memorized by reading over and over, and they're up there giving their speech, and you can almost tell they're reading their speech that's right in front of them. Or maybe their reactions aren't quite in sync with what they're saying as they would be in normal conversation. So I thought, not a good idea. What I had been doing by learning it word for word is I created a neural pathway for my speech that was really a rut. A very deep rut. And then in the stress of the moment, being in front of so many people, I was thrown out of my rut. And I had no alternate paths upon which my brain could recall my speech. So from that, I learned that I needed to internalize my speech and not memorize it. Today, you will learn 10 different ways that you could internalize a speech, not memorize it, not rely on reading on notes, and make eye contact that connects with your audience. In that pile of papers in front of you, you should see a handout that says 10 ways to internalize a speech and reduce dependence on notes. If you can't find it, I have more copies. Everyone has that? Be on the side that has the 10 ways. What I will do is go through each of these 10 ways. One of them we will spend a lot of extra time on practicing. Way number 1, repetition. Read it several times out loud. If you've written out your speeches, have you done this? Have you used repetition where you read it out loud several times? This can work to a point. I like to write out my speeches because it helps me make sure I have the organization and flow and that it sounds good to the ear. But if you keep doing it, you'll probably never learn it. It will just help you get the content down so you could maybe move on to another step. Another step is way number 2, chunking. You can chunk your content and practice parts of it. I use this all the time because a lot of my presentations are longer, 45 minutes to an hour, sometimes more. And I'll be honest with you, just like Jane said, who has the time to practice in that big chunk all at once? So what I've learned to do is I will take short segments, usually under 10 minutes, and just practice those segments. Practice the introduction, practice the conclusion, practice each of my points, practice the story so it really hits home. And the important part in chunking is that you also practice the transitions. Because I have learned through experience, if you don't practice the transitions, you may get to the end of chunk 1 and you know you're supposed to go to chunk 2, but how are you going to get there? So practice, for example, if you're doing your introduction, practice the transition that follows your introduction so that will all flow when you put it together. Way number 3 is gestures. Now gestures, most people think of it as being something for the audience, whether it's a non-communicative open type of gesture like I'm doing right now, where I'm gesturing to you to just show you my ideas, or you can have specific gestures that can help not only your audience, but help you remember your content as well. For example, I might give a speech on public speaking that has 3 points. And for each point, I might have a specific gesture to both help my audience and to help me as a speaker. Here's an example. When you're speaking, you want to focus on your audience. Make sure you understand what they need and why they want to hear what you have to say. The second technique that you need to do is you need to internalize your content, not memorize your content, so that you can flow with your content, so that you can be confident, and so that you can make eye contact with your audience. The third technique to really connecting with your audience is to tell a story. Now, if you're in a technical field, you might, I can't do that fairy tale stuff. They would just think I'm weird. Well, stories, although they should have some emotion, for example, pain of loss or fear of something bad happening, don't have to be all fluffy. You can tell a case study of our customer had this problem. It was causing them a great deal of frustration. They were losing money. Through our process, this is now the better improved situation. And this is how it works. So remember these 3 things that you have to do if you want to connect with an audience. Focus on your audience, internalize, don't memorize your content, and tell a story. So see how those gestures can perhaps help you as you are preparing a presentation to even just remember and internalize your content. Way number 4, method of loci. This is also known as a memory journal or a mind palace technique. And this is an ancient technique that the Greeks used, where as they were practicing their speeches, they would either physically take a journey and do portions of their speeches at different waypoints of the journey, or they would take a journey in their mind. Some people now even would use the face of a clock and leave different pieces of their presentation at the clock. So I have used this technique. For example, I might give my introduction at my front door. And then I will give point number 1 at the refrigerator, point number 2 at the stove, point number 3 at the sink, and then my conclusion at the dining room table. The advantage of doing this is when I'm giving my speech, I can mentally place myself in those positions and pick up my content. What was it that I left at the refrigerator? You know, that type of idea. So this is a technique you could use. Now I saw Jim nodding. Jim, have you used this technique?
I have, yeah.
You have. Tell us how you use it.
So I walk through the house.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly that. So the introduction is often in my bedroom before, at the beginning of the day, and then I walk through the day from room to room with each part of the topic. That works really well.
Great. And then when you give it, do you actually ever find yourself physically back in that place to get that content? Or has it just helped you internalize it?
It's in my mind.
Right, right. So this might be a fun technique to try sometime. The fifth technique is the technique we're going to spend a little extra time in, and that is keywords. I use this technique as a bridge from having a completely written out speech to having a speech where I use perhaps no notes. But I need some intermediate step. And some people, this is their final step. They'll just go up with some keyword notes because, as you will see, using this method allows you to use notes and yet still make eye contact. Go ahead and turn your sheet over to the activity. This activity has two parts. In the first part, you will read this paragraph, and then for each sentence, you can write up to 4 keywords, and if you want to use additional symbols or pictures, you can do that as well. And the point is to pick words or symbols that will help you remember the content. The first step might be to actually make hash marks at the end of every sentence. And you will see some sentences are longer than others. So you might have to get a little creative on those long sentences. Does anyone have questions on what you're about to do for activity part 1? No? Okay, I will give you not a lot of time, so don't think about this too much. I'll give you about 3 minutes to write keywords for those 8 sentences. So this should be a very quick activity. All right, time is up. Now for part 2 of this activity, you will take your paper and fold it in half so that you only see your keywords. And what you will do with a partner, and we have an even number, so this will work. You two will be a partner, you two, and you two, is that you will each do the entire paragraph, one person, and then the other person does the entire paragraph, using the keyword notes only, no looking back. If you have to, just make stuff up. But there is one important rule to doing this, and this is how people use notes yet look like they're making great eye contact. And the secret is talk to people, not to paper. And what that means is when you look down at your notes, like you'll look down at line 1, your lips should not be moving. Only when you look up at your partner should you begin to talk. So if you're looking down, don't talk. It's when you look up at your partner that you deliver the content of the first line, and then you can look down again and deliver the content of the second line. So I'll give you, I don't know, we'll probably say another 3 minutes to each share. So go ahead, pick one person to go first.
Oh, sure, yeah.
All right, let's come back. And Jim, I'd like you to do that in front of the group now.
Oh.
Yeah.
And Jim, you're going to do it without notes. Just tell us off the top of your
Have I internalized the notes here?
Yeah.
About 1972, a psychological researcher decided to do some research on the impact of delayed gratification, particularly on children and as they then progress through their lives. He conducted an experiment he called the Marshmallow Experiment, and the details of that were that there were about 600 kids that they brought into a room, and with the one adult experimenter, and each of the kids was given one marshmallow. And we're told that if they ate that marshmallow immediately, that they would not get another marshmallow, but that if they postponed eating that while the experimenter left the room, so the kids were unsupervised, that when the experimenter came back, if the marshmallow was still there, they would get a second marshmallow. So they did that. The experimenter left the room, I believe it was 15 minutes, I don't recall the exact time, came back in, and lo and behold, a third of the kids had delayed gratification, still had their marshmallow. The other 2/3 did not, and they had presumably then eaten their marshmallows. The marshmallow was gone one way or another. So they recorded which kid was which in terms of whether they had delayed gratification, got the second marshmallow or not, and then followed up a number of years later to see what the characteristics were of those kids as they grew. And in particular, as they got to high school age, they looked at SAT scores, and they found that SAT scores were higher for the kids who had done delayed gratification. And then presumably after that period had also been higher achievers. So the implication of that, I think, is that delayed gratification is a skill you can teach early that will have a positive impact on your future performance, and something we could all, I think, probably do in our own lives.
Thank you, Jim. That was great. Now, of course, we all read the information, but Jim, if you were speaking in front of a group and you touched upon the concept of delayed gratification and used this material, any deviation you made, which was not much actually, no one would know because
Correct.
They wouldn't know exactly what had been written down. But do you see in this experiment that we just did on a keyword activity how you can internalize information from something that's completely written out to keywords to doing it with no notes at all? Try this the next time you're either working on your own prepared speech or if you have someone else's content that you need to deliver as well. Plus, I think I picked something that almost everyone had heard about this experiment before. It's a well-known experiment. Looking quickly at our last few ways to internalize your content. Use picture and symbol notes. One time, and I've done this to varying degrees in other presentations, I did a whole 45-minute speech with this as my page of notes, where most of it was pictures. And I'll even do the intro. The intro just had a pair of eyeglasses, and that would trigger me to tell the following story. I'll never forget the first time I got my first pair of eyeglasses. I was 8 years old, and without my glasses, I couldn't even see the big E on the eye chart. But that day in the optometrist's office, as my mother and I walked out and I had my new glasses on, it was like a whole new world. I felt like Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz. Everything was a different way of seeing. Mom, I can read the stop sign all the way from here. And the trees, Mom, the trees, I can see their branches. They're like a painting. Mom, a tear was trickling down her cheek. Mom, you have wrinkles. And that was the opening to that particular speech. And the whole speech was triggered primarily by pictures. Pictures can be quicker than words to get to your memory. So consider using pictures. Sometimes, if you're doing a PowerPoint, I'll even print out my slides as my notes, just in case the PowerPoint doesn't work, because that can trigger you as well. But you never know, you might have a problem with your PowerPoint. Number 7, practice from an outline. This is pretty obvious, and it will force you to outline your speech, because I have listened to several speeches where I wonder, where the heck are they going with this speech? And I am not following the content. Having an outline, even if you never use it, other than preparing your speech, can be quite helpful, but you can also use it in lieu of having speaking notes, just to keep yourself on point. Number 8, tell stories. Stories that are relevant to your content. If your audience remembers your story, they'll remember your point. But even better, stories can help you remember your content because they're not just some abstract points. You can follow a story in your mind like a movie. So the more stories you have that are relevant to your content, the easier it will be for you to remember your content. Number 9, use visual aids strategically. Now, you don't have to have visual aids for everything, but for both you and your audience, if you have specific quotes or you have statistics that you want to display that might be hard for you to remember, throw them up as a visual aid, or have a board or a flip chart so that you don't have to remember those statistics, and that will ease some of the stress that you have on the cognitive load from those statistics. And finally, number 10, use notes on the handout. I do this all the time. Like this. This is your handout. I just have a few additional notes on the handout that I can use as my speaking notes. Try one or more of these ways as you internalize your content for your next presentation so that you can be more confident, more credible, make better eye contact with your audience. Internalize, don't memorize.